Good morning. Again, I'm Dr. Peter Zizali, and I'm very grateful to be joined with my colleague, Dr. Tom Cornford. Tom, just to give a little background, teaches at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, where he's a senior lecturer. He teaches into the Contemporary Performance program, as well as the Research Degree program. Tom was trained at LAMDA, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts. Since his acting career, he has shifted to being a director, a dramaturg, and of course a scholar who also trains scholars. Tom's specialties in actor training are looking at the work of Michael Chekhov and also specializing in the politics of actor training. Tom has two books that are forthcoming later this year in 2020. The first was a co-edited volume with Cass Fleming entitled Michael Chekhov in the 21st Century, New Pathways. Mithune will be releasing that. And Tom will also be releasing a monograph, Theater Studios, a political history of ensemble theater making, which will be released by Routledge. Tom, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
Cool. So you recently gave a distinct keynote address. And what was the conference where you were at again, if you would just remind our viewers?
It was The Makings of the Actor was the title of the conference. It was in Athens. It was actually a year ago. It was June last year when I was able to fly to Athens rather than being locked down here in Bristol. But yeah, so I was speaking to a really interesting mixed international crowd of actor trainers, scholars, and they wanted me to talk about the politics of training. So I decided to focus on this idea of trying to shift actor training towards a radical political agenda.
Wonderful. And can you just unpack for our listeners what you mean by the radical politics of actor training?
Well, I suppose one thing I mean is that actor training has rarely had radical politics, and it's rarely really been consciously politically engaged, at least where I'm coming from in the UK and in the States, where I also have worked a little bit and understand a little bit about their training. So I suppose the shift towards the radical is, as Angela Davis reminds us, a shift towards thinking about the roots of things. About political solutions which get at the roots of a problem. So I was interested in pursuing the roots of actor training and thinking about the political qualities that they have, the political structures, the political ideologies that are embodied consciously or unconsciously in them, and trying to think about how we might make them more radical in the sense of somewhat tearing it up and starting again with an agenda focused on social justice.
Indeed, and just to be more specific, when we're talking about social justice, I'm assuming, just having read your beautiful keynote, we're looking at matters of how white privilege in particular has become manifest throughout the history, the genealogy of actor training. Can you speak to that a bit in terms of how identity, particularly with respect to racial identity and identity of social class and so forth, how that has played out in the history of actor training and how you'd like to shake it up?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for the first thing, we often hear about lineages and genealogies in the sense of the roots of our training. People still tend to say, well, I studied with so and so, who studied with so and so, who studied with Stanislavski. There's something you kind of still hear, and of course, those lineages, as historical lineages tend to, have gone back to white men, principally. If you look at the book about actor training that the late Ali Hodge edited, which really brought it into a kind of scholarly, sort of much wider kind of scholarly discussion at the end of the last century, started, not wrongly at all, it's not a criticism, it's a critique. It started with Stanislavski, with Meyerholt, with Brecht, with Michel Saint-Denis, and then went on through the mainly white men whose work followed theirs, and Copeau, of course, as well in France. I suppose I wanted to point out that this is not an accident, that these people are all white men from the West, the global North, as we might now call it, but that in many ways as in all fields of study, there's a kind of great white man theory tacitly at work here, which is that that we have to trace our ideas back to them and see them in a context produced by great white men, and of course for white men principally. If you look at the people who have benefited from actor training, in terms of trainers and actors, most of them have been white men.
Indeed. And I also want to acknowledge that there are two white men having this conversation who come from a privileged Western background. So just to acknowledge that and moving forward. So in shaking it up, so you very eloquently acknowledge how that history has seemed to be embedded, and yet you offer a really nice move in your work where you cite Joan Littlewood in particular with the theater workshop and this idea of montage and a sort of amorphous lineage. You cite Foucault's disorderly lineages, in fact, to help unpack that. So I was wondering if you could speak to, in terms of how to shake it up, if you can talk, whether you're going to cite Littlewood or not, but how to sort of break through this perceived structure, this linear structure, which in fact is, like a lot of such structures, is a bit of a myth.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to cite Joan Littlewood, and I guess, I think that what she did, which I think was really brilliant, was that she refused the power structures that tended to come with training. She developed a training with Theatre Workshop and for Theatre Workshop, which was collective. So it wasn't simply about her. There is no such thing as Littlewood technique, and there never was. She didn't kind of theorize it under her own name. And she didn't see it as her own practice. She saw it as a process of, I characterize it in the studio's book as a process of bricolage. So of kind of cobbling bits together and using them informally, spontaneously, and contingently. So she kind of grabbed stuff from Laban, who she knew a little bit, and Lisa Ullman, who taught, with him in Manchester at the same time as Littlewood was working with Theatre Workshop, and from Stanislavski, from his books, from other kinds of books that were being published about expressionist theatre at the time. And she kind of cobbled things together, and indeed added them to more conventional kinds of British training that she'd received in her time at RADA. So she didn't have a program, and she didn't want to kind of patent a method. She just wanted to grab what she could find and use it for the purposes, which were always changing, that her company had. And really crucial in that, I think, was that it was also a dialogic process. So there were also people in the company who had other kinds of training, and they were kind of, so there's always a dialogue at play in what she's doing. It's not about kind of patenting a method under her name, which is something which I critique as a kind of problem of actor training as it was developed, which I wouldn't blame on any particular kind of trainer. I think that, to go back to Angela Davis, the problem is in the roots, the material and historical roots.
Yeah, and it seems that she, just judging from your writing, that she really met the moment, which led. This is somebody who was not necessarily part of an institutional structure such as the Moscow Art Theater, or the Théâtre Colombier, and Capot's theater in Paris, outside Paris, I should say. So she really met the moment and made do with what she had, as you indicate. What resources, limited as they were, and worked in tandem with her collaborators in the richest sense. Do you see any evidence of that? We're in such a moment today where training is moving online. Training is even prior to the COVID crisis. Training was in many respects more varied and diverse, and conversations around the diverse training approach were very much underway. Do you see that evident today in ways that have hope and possibility for a more radical future as you envision it?
I think I see hope is in a broader and more diverse, I guess you would have to call it, group of people who are conducting the training, and who are bringing their ideas and their methods to the more conventional structures of training that we've had for some time. I think though that the structural problem remains. I think that if you want a job at a drama school, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can teach a kind of recognized method. And if we look at those recognized methods, they are Meisner technique or Michael Chekhov technique
Or the vocal technique, the being certified as a designated teacher and Linklater or Fitzmaurice or fill in the blank. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason for that, if we again to go back to the roots, is that those techniques were developed by teachers who were working in precarious situations. They needed students. Strasberg and Meisner and Uta Hagen and so on in New York in the post-war period, they needed students, just like the students needed jobs. And one of the ways of getting that is to kind of convince the students that you've got the answers to their problems. So then the student becomes this person with the problem and the trainer becomes this person with the answer. And of course, you get a kind of guru relationship easily developing under those circumstances. And I think those are material circumstances. I don't think anyone is personally to blame in a way for what's happening here. But those material circumstances lead to this kind of branding of techniques as solutions to your problems. And then you get people kind of arguing over whether Meisner technique or such and such another technique is a better solution to your problems. And what gets lost in that process, as far as I can see, is what's outside of the frame of these kind of recognized techniques, which obviously are the techniques of people who have had power socially and culturally. And also, what is potentially lost there is the dialogue with students, because actually, these radical changes come from the base. Usually, they don't come from the top. And so, the other thing which would give me hope there is students saying, "Well, hang on, this doesn't really work for me. What you're teaching me."
Yeah, and that's, if I may say so, and that's to some extent there's a movement, there's a current in your very institution at Central. That's student-led, as I understand it, where students have challenged the power structure, particularly the white male power structure. Everything, the whole imbroglio surrounding Gavin Henderson, for example. Do you see it on the ground at Central, in sort of a progressive and hopeful way? I think of Darren Orum's work, for example, in your voice program, teaching, to a more diverse community of vocal pedagogies that aren't, just the practice of, say, Edith Skinner, that in itself has a sort of, a very limited purview. So is it happening at Central? Do you see progress? And if not at Central, do you see it elsewhere, even in incremental forms?
Yeah, I absolutely do. The person who you would need to talk to really about this is Sherelle Luckett in the States. The Black acting methods is really, I don't want to say pioneering. I'm trying to think of a word that isn't pioneering. It's really breaking new ground and is really, really important in this area. Darren's work likewise, in terms of working with neurodiverse students, and in terms of decolonizing voice, is really significant. So there are really great initiatives happening, and Central, I need to acknowledge that we're going through a really difficult process of reckoning with some really shocking, but I would have to say probably, I'm sorry to say, not surprising things that have been revealed by principally by students. And of course, as in all institutions, there are many tensions and different ways of approaching these questions. I'm glad to say that not before time, they're really being taken very seriously now. And that's great. It's, of course, in these situations always terrible that all these things have had to happen in order for these questions to be taken seriously. But I think now that they are, there's definitely cause for hope. But again, I would sort of drag us back to the question of structure, of how are the structures of training really being altered in order to allow them to really place different voices at the center. And, as you've said, this is a conversation between two white men. And, my work is essentially kind of critiquing many ways in which whiteness works. And one of them is by being invisible. So now we've made it visible, then great. But then but whiteness is also a structure of power. And so how do we dismantle that structure of power? And I think that, I can't really say too much about it, but that question is up for grabs in my institution, and as I understand in others. And I think there's cause for hope there. But these things are slow processes, because institutions are slow to change. Fortunately, they've been rapidly sped up recently, but still, there's a lot of work that needs to go into it, and I'm glad to say seems to be being done.
Indeed, yes, and to your point, it's not. This is a dilemma, a serious dilemma confronting institutions worldwide, especially in Anglophone countries such as ours. So Central is by no means an outlier.
No, and actually, I think when I wrote that paper, I had a check on for example, on the Intercultural Theatre Institute in Singapore, and I was thinking, like, that's a really great institution, really interested in its work. And even there, I was looking. I hope I'm now wrong, 12 months later, but at the time I was looking at it, and he had a situation where it was acting on the one hand, and then there were the other sort of minoritized, marginalized forms, like Chinese opera and so on, that they were teaching outside of acting. And so immediately, we have this kind of tacit prioritizing of what are white Eurocentric approaches to acting. Now, that's that's something which perhaps they need to do, because of course we are preparing students for a brutally competitive and often deeply kind of retrograde and conservative job market. Now, my position on that is that institutions need to reject the industry and really work against it and say, I'm sorry, we're going to prepare for the industry that does not yet exist, and we will allow it to catch up. I think that's really a crucial aspect of training, but that is not how programs are marketed and sold generally, and often how students understand. Many students, in any case, understand their relationship to the program. They're here to train. They're training in order to get work, and that's an easy. It's another structure whereby, social injustice is reproduced. And so I think we really need to think about broader questions about the structures of the industry and the ways in which training relates to the industry too.
Yeah, of course, and of course, training has taken their cues from the industry for centuries. Well, not centuries, but decades. And it's a difficult proposition to make, of course. I'm certainly not disagreeing with you. I think it's insightful to no end. But ultimately, acting schools are vocational endeavors, and they're transactional in their very nature. Trying to explain to a parent that, especially one who is not involved in the entertainment industry or the arts in any way, shape, and form, that a child in their case, wants to go and train to be an actor. They want to hear some tangible results in most instances, they meaning the parents, in terms of, okay, well, what kind of job is this going to get you? This idea of return on investment, of course, is not new to just acting. It's a conceit across disciplines, in the academy, but it's particularly applicable to ours. So how do we take your vision, your radical vision, which is indeed an important one, to shape the industry before the industry shapes us? But how do we sell that in this commodified context? And I use the word sell very deliberately, because we are in capitalist systems in which these transactions are made.
It's a very difficult question, because of course the ground on which we're having the conversation is not the ground that we would choose to have the question on, and this is often like an important political point that we nonetheless have to begin from where we are. I think one point would be to just acknowledge where that is. So another thing I think I mentioned in that keynote is that I did a little bit of digging around in the sort of the formal history of British actor training, which is just over a century basically old. And Beerbohm Tree set up his academy turn of the 20th century, which is now RADA. It wasn't RADA then, it was Trees Academy. And he had a list of disciplines that he was going to teach the students. And I looked at Nicholas Heitner, who was then the artistic director of the National Theatre's similar list, which he produced when he was asked to do a review of actor training somewhere around about 100 years after Tree had done his list. And the lists were pretty much the same. And top of both lists was voice. And I looked at the theatres that Tree was managing at the time, and they were fairly recently built and were about 20% larger than the theatres had been a little while before. And so you think, okay, well, voice is important because your actors need to be heard in these bigger theatres. And Nick Heitner is there at the National Theatre with certainly one, probably two auditoria, which are notoriously difficult to be heard in. And so, of course, they've got the same. They have the same project. They need to train people in order to fulfill the commercial requirements of their industry. And in fact, Nick Heitner said in an interview, he said, "We consume the products of drama schools." So there's no point pretending that isn't the case, but actually by acknowledging that that's the case and saying, okay, so that's where we are. I think we can train students to be able to do those things, but also to critique them and to be aware of how they are being shaped by those agendas. And casting is another thing, which I've done quite a bit of work on and looked at. And, the astonishing reproduction of racial, gender, class stereotypes in casting. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing in its utter predictability. Yeah. And again, I think these are questions which we need to open up with students and not just sort of have them hanging around tacitly in the room, but say, look, this is the reality of the ways in which much of the industry works. Okay, and that's not to endorse it or say this is a good thing or you need to fall in line with it, but you need to have a relationship with it, because these are the structures and the ideas which are shaping how you are going to be represented as a class of person, whatever that is, whether that's to do with your race or your class position or your gender, or all sorts of other things. And that's, I think, to have students have a relationship with that, an active, critical, engaged relationship with that, is the beginning of change, because then you see them going into the industry and saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept that. The person who kind of springs to mind here, I guess, historically, is Paul Robeson. If you look at Robeson's film career, what happens is he accepts a series of stereotypes of the black man across his film career, but they get less stereotypical, and he engages with them critically in different ways at each step along the way. And he knows what he's doing. He is a very long way from an idiot. An extremely intelligent man who knew exactly what he was doing. And that's not to say that he utterly rejected that stereotyping. He saw it as a compromise, as a political compromise that he needed to make for the project that he was engaged in. And I think if we can start to have these conversations with students, and certainly having more diverse faculties will make that, well, not make it easier, make it possible. It's not, it isn't possible for me to have those conversations with black students, for example, in the way that a black member of the faculty can, and nor should it be. It's about, in that case, it's about black experience, and what I'm doing here is mainly critiquing whiteness, and not centering blackness, because it's not my place to do that. So, but yeah, I think rather than simply accepting that we are selling something, and then being quiet about it, we can accept it and then try to change it from there.
Well, and it starts with conversations, such as this one, and conversations beyond this one, obviously, with black and brown bodies, white bodies, disabled bodies, able bodies, old and young, men and women, or those that identify as both. It's part of a large inclusive discussion. I'm very glad to have had this one with you today, Tom. Um, Thanks so much. So the book, just quickly, two books coming out. You want to just give a little pitch for those, which is largely related to our conversation today, of course.
Yeah, so the first one, which is coming out pretty soon, I gather, with Matthew and Bloomsbury, is Michael Chekhov in the 21st Century. As you said before, I've co-edited it with Cass Fleming. The aim of that really is to look at Chekhov's extensive archival materials from the work in his studio, which was in the UK and then in the US, and bring them into contact with practice research and contemporary practice research in various different strands of theatre, particularly not looking at conventional actor training for sort of play script kind of roles. So there's a section on devising and collective creation. There's a section that I've written on dramaturgy and collaborative playwriting. There's another on voice, which Darren Oram, who you mentioned, has written. One on movement and dance. One on scenography by Sinead Rush, who also has a book about Chekhov's technique out, and one on sort of socially engaged and therapeutic practices by Kiva McAvinci. So it's a question of looking, reevaluating, critiquing, and engaging with how Chekhov's technique can be used in all of these different spheres, in the present. And then the other book is it's called Theatre Studios. It's an exploration of this phenomenon, sort of mid-20th century phenomenon, really, of the studio, which is a sort of experimental theatre organisation committed to training and collective ensemble practice. So I take three examples: Michel Saint-Denis studios in the UK, either side of the Second World War, and Michael Chekhov's studio, and then Theatre Workshop, and Joan Littlewood, as we mentioned briefly. And I look at each of them. I look at the kind of relations that characterized them as organizations. So it's a kind of political critique of these three different ways of creating art collectively. And then it concludes with a chapter thinking about the studio in the present, and a little bit of a reflection on some time that I spent working with Secret Theatre, which was a sort of ensemble which was put together for a couple of years at the Lyric Hammersmith in London in between 2013 and 2015. So it's really it's a way of trying to think about ensemble theatre making as a kind of creative political activity, and its history and its potential for the present.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So that's Theatre Studios, A Political History of Ensemble Theatre Making, Routledge Press, and the co-edited volume with Cass Fleming, Michael Chekhov in the 21st Century, New Pathways, Mithun, both coming out later this year. Tom, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really, really appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners have too. All right. So cheers.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Peter.